Hey everybody, welcome to Jazztruth. I'm George Colligan, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about piano technique, and just to give you a little bit of background about me. I really started as a trumpet player. I did have about a month's worth of piano lessons when I was in second grade, but I didn't practice at all and I wasn't really interested. And even when I was playing trumpet fourth and fifth grade, I didn't really practice. It wasn't really until I got to middle school that a band director there named Lee Stevens really inspired me to practice, so on and so forth. And I can tell the whole story another time, but I ended up kind of going to drums and then going to piano. So when I ended up starting to get more serious about piano as a performer, I was more interested in composition, but as a performer I had no idea what to do technically. And I sort of had a little bit of a knack for the instrument, and I was starting to practice a lot and also do gigs probably too early for my development. And I started to have some pain in my right hand, and I didn't know what to do. And I ended up going to the Banff Center Summer Jazz Workshop. There was a pianist there named Bill Peterson. I think that was his name. I haven't seen him in years. But he hipped me to this idea that piano playing should not be like lifting weights. That's essentially the philosophy. And what he told me about was this thing called the Taubman Technique. And this is a technique that came from a famous educator named Dorothy Taubman. And you can actually, I'm going to put links in the bottom there to her videos. There's a film about her called The Choreography. I think it's called The Choreography of the Hands. So her technique was designed primarily for players who had had injuries or were trying to overcome injuries. And they're very common. These sort of repetitive motion injuries are very common. So she developed a way that sort of takes away that strain and that idea that you need to really be like exercising your muscles in a way that's, as Bill Peterson used to say, like hours of toil. And he would go like this. And he had carpal tunnel syndrome, which I never had, but I did have sort of like tendonitis. Bill told me that he couldn't even hold a fork. He was in such pain, and discovering this technique totally saved his career. I ended up finding a teacher at Peabody named Fred Karpoff. He was a grad student at the time, and he was studying the Taubman technique because he had been injured. And he actually studied with somebody who studied with Taubman, so there's kind of this direct link there. So the Taubman aesthetic is really, it's not about the fingers per se. It's not about exercising your fingers or feeling like you have to make your fingers stronger. It's more about fundamental principles of using your weight, using rotative motions, avoiding twisting with the wrists, keeping the hand and the wrist and the forearm aligned. Also using your real estate on the keys. I'm going to demonstrate, of course. But essentially this idea, we could just take the weight and rotation as being the most important aspects of this technique. And you can do this at home if you hold up your hands and you go like this, like you're flexing. You feel that. Then you go like this, which is the rotation, which feels more relaxed. I hope it's the second one. So this idea that everything can be a rotative motion, you will find that you're using your bigger muscles, not the smaller muscles. And that way you actually don't, the idea is that you won't get tired because it's not an endurance thing. It's actually more about efficiency. And so one of the things that if you choose to watch the Taubman video, a lot of the pianists who give testimonials in the beginning, they talk about how they would practice for endurance sake. They'd practice the same piece 5 times through to make sure that they had built up the endurance, and they talked about how their hands were throbbing, and that felt good. And Dorothy Taubman is against that. She says in her Brooklyn accent, she says, "Oh, the endurance, the very word is abhorrent. It means that you have to endure something." So the idea is that it should be as effortless as possible. And if I had not discovered this approach, and also disclaimer, I'm not a certified Taubman teacher, because there is actually a Taubman Institute and you can get certification in that. I am not a certified teacher, but I can say that these general principles have really helped me to be able to play all these years. And even in times where I am having pain from just being old, this approach has really helped me to stay active as a performer without feeling like I have to practice 15 hours a day. The thought with this is that it's something that could be applied to anything, but I can demonstrate just a few things that I normally talk about, and then the idea is that when you feel it and it's working correctly, that you can apply it to everything that you're doing. So as I said, fundamental principles that can be applied to anything. So let's take a look. Okay, let's talk about weight for a minute. So the idea of using your weight is the idea that you should feel, again, not as if you're getting all the sound with your fingers, that it's actually coming from, you can even think of it almost through your feet, like you have to sort of channel your energy through your whole body into the keyboard. And we can talk a little bit about hand shape. Some of you may have studied with a teacher who told you to curl your fingers or to play as if you're holding an orange or a tennis ball, or that you're balancing pennies. So there's all kinds of older ways of thinking about that, and luckily I never had a teacher who told me to do that. The way I think of it, in line with the Taubman idea, is that you take your hands, and I'll just stand up for a minute, but you drop them at your sides, and you can take a little bit of a deep breath and just feel almost like your blood is rushing to your hands, and then bring up your hands, and how do they look and how do they feel? Totally relaxed as you have them at your sides. And so this is how I try to envision my hands, as just totally sort of a neutral position, like not flexed, but just normal. So naturally there would be less tension in that sense. So if the motions are coming from the forearms and the shoulders and all of that, and you're putting that into the sound, then it is not going to tax your forearms and all these channels here. You can do the same thing, drop your hands to the sides, and then you bring them up, and then you just drop your hands. Just don't worry, it's not going to be a chord necessarily, but just drop them. And so you're just releasing your energy. I know it seems ridiculous, but the idea is to feel more of weight and gravity and use those things to get the sound rather than flexing your fingers, because that is the kind of thing that could cause you pain eventually. So eventually you want to get this into, with control and all of those things. So some people have remarked that they think I have a big sound, but it's really coming from weight, and I actually think of it coming through the feet all the way up through my body and into the piano, and sort of channeling weight. Now, this is something that I mention a lot in lessons, and I just want to again preface that I am not a serious martial artist, but I did take a very basic kung fu class about 13 years ago. It got me to thinking about this approach, and it's very much like when you think of martial artists and how they, whether it's Tai Chi or whether it's Kung Fu or that type of thing, but a lot of martial arts is channeling energy, and certainly channeling your opponent's energy too. But it's about the flow of energy. And so I don't believe that martial arts is so much about having huge muscles and working out. Although, martial artists work out. But so when we did punching exercises, it was more about where is the energy coming from. And a lot of it was coming from the torso, which you wouldn't normally think. Oftentimes when people who don't know how to fight, they try to punch, and it's all coming from the shoulder and the arm. Well, in this case, all the punching was sort of going back and forth like this with the torso. So this area is there's actually more musculature here. And so it's basically your whole body and your legs driving these punches. So that's how I try to think of it, is it's got to be coming from more than just the fingers, Now we'll talk a little bit about rotation in the hand. Okay, so when we talk about rotation in the hand, let's just put the hand in this sort of natural position here. And if you just sort of go back and forth, that's essentially the motion. You're basically channeling your weight from one side to the other, just rocking back and forth. And eventually you want to get it to the point where you don't really notice it, or it's not exaggerated. Like, you don't necessarily want to, that you can over rotate, but you get just enough. So a lot of this is coordination. So one thing I recommend is you can do that, just back and forth, and then you could do, not fast, but you can do trills with each finger and just get that same rotative motion back and forth. And there's also sort of an in and out motion too. One thing we have to realize is that oftentimes we think that we have to keep the hand sort of in one place, but there's actually so much real estate that we can use to keep our alignment and also make more out of our rotations. So there's times when you may have to come in to get a note to feel comfortable. There's one really cool thing in the Taubman video, among many things, but she says you can't miss a note if your finger is on it. So this has to do with choreography, and I can talk a little bit more about that later. But anyway, so if you can just do each finger, and you shouldn't feel like it's stressful or that you're flexing your muscle. It's more about the wrist and the forearm. Should feel totally relaxed. So I just think of it as these rotative motions. And then you can do, this is something I worked on with Fred Karpoff for many, many lessons. We just worked on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see that I bring the thumb in just a little bit and come out a little bit. So my wife just showed me a video of Barry Harris talking about this type of idea, not in the same terms, but it's essentially the same thing. So I don't know if he specifically studied Taubman or if this is just sort of a, common thought. But he demonstrates something very similar to what I just did, and he talks about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 being one motion. See, it's just a rotation. And he does this. So you have 15 notes, but only 3 motions. And he says, who's going to play faster? Somebody that has to do 15 motions or somebody that can do the same thing in 3? So again, we're going to do our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the idea is if you're playing efficiently, you shouldn't feel any stress. It's all just moving in space and coordinating your weight. So mean, I'm maybe exaggerating it a bit, but I'm trying to make it all come from the weight. So if you're using big muscles, they're not gonna get that tightness that you get if you're using the smaller muscles. So that's, this is what I think about all the time, and I've been doing it essentially for 30 years. Another thing that I assign, and this is something else that I got from Fred Karpov, I think, it's been a long time, but we worked on the B scale. So apparently the B scale is, a lot of people play the C scale because there aren't any sharps or flats. But the C scale is actually the hardest to play because there's nothing to grab onto, whereas the B scale has a nice balance of white and black notes. So that's actually considered, from the Taubman standpoint, the easiest scale. So we worked on B scale 2 octaves. And the point is, I mean, eventually it can be fast, but you want to sort of feel the weight. So I don't think of really, it's not effort, it's more like letting go. I'm dropping. So if you're working efficiently, you should not feel any stress. So as you get fast, if you can do the same principle, so that's all. Again, the more I think about it, I want to make sure I'm doing it right, but I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have this technique. Another thing to consider with this idea is that when one finger is active, I don't even want to say flexed, but let's say it's active, the rest of the hand should be as relaxed as possible. So what can happen sometimes is that you play a hard passage, and instead of thinking finger by finger, the whole hand gets tense and it becomes like just this ball of tightness. And you want to, that's why playing things slowly and just thinking of the weight going through each individual finger. So again, we go back to our scale. So for every finger that goes down, the other 4 should be totally relaxed. Another thing to consider is that you only want as much effort, let's say, as necessary. So again, we can go back to our idea of the martial arts strike. Again, people that don't know how to channel their energy, and maybe they just have big muscles or whatever, they punch, but it's all coming from the biceps. So they're actually working their muscles when they actually need to think more about speed and motion. And again, channeling the energy from the lower part, which can add more impact. That's how I like to think of it anyway. And it's the same thing. If you weren't doing that efficiently, you would get super tired. You wouldn't be able to fight. So we have our scale and we have our trills. Now, when playing a melody, you want to try to incorporate all of these concepts, and you may see a little bit of the sort of in and out of the keys, like using the real estate, as I call it, when I play this melody for you. bebop melodies that you can practice and you know what you're actually going to play, it's easier to choreograph because you know it's sort of all pre-planned. Harder potentially to do with improvisation, but the idea is that the more you do this and the more you choreograph and get this from doing short drills and applying it to various phrases, that it should become so ingrained that you don't have to think about it. Again, just like martial arts, that's why they do all these drills, so that when they're actually in the heat of combat, that they can move in a way so that they don't have to think about it. It's automatic. So that should be the same thing with this, is that it's just sort of like baked in. Another thing to consider with this idea of not developing stress is that there's really sort of a threshold of how loud you can really play on the piano. At a certain point, it's just not going to get any louder, and it's going to be sort of diminishing returns. So I took a great lesson years ago with Fred Hirsch, and he said, never play above mezzo forte. And while the pure idea of that, maybe I don't necessarily agree with, but just thinking about that idea in terms of going for tone rather than just brute force, even though I like to play percussively, and certainly I'm into McCoy Tyner and Harold Mayburn and people who really play strong, but there is a point where you're just not going to get anything else. So that can also help to not, essentially muscle the instrument. So anyway, I hope this was helpful, and we're going to be dealing with it in some later episodes, but this has been Jazztruth. I'm George Colligan, and we'll see you next time.